So we're going to do the Bleeding Edge methodology workshop today. Who was at the last one? We had one about 3 weeks ago. So we talked about methodologies and methods, so sort of the theory and the practice. What was our actual focus for last time? Amy, do you remember? No, you weren't. Yeah.
We looked at exploring theories and methods that would be interesting in the Innovation Amplified space. So explored Innovation Amplified, what the sort of structure of it is and what contributes to it, and then drew from our own memories things that might be relevant that could help build it further.
All right, so we're going to go one step further on that today because we've had a couple of expert sessions since then. We had Amy talking to us about ethnography, and we had Dirk talking about social psychology. We also have the benefit of having Roger here with us in Canberra today, so we're going to use a lot of his background with UTS around innovation frames. And we're going to revisit the Innovation Amplified model. So in terms of getting the slides forward, where do I press a button? Thank you. All right, so has everyone seen this model before? Anyone, is this the first time for anyone here? So let's just go through this quickly then, because I think most people have talked through this. This is something that's been developed particularly out of the A-Lab experience. David and Nina, I think, were the main sort of progenitors of it. But it also follows a lot of innovation theory that we've looked at in the past. So there's three main sort of aspects of it. The first one that's probably useful to talk about is the engaging, because this is a model about how you get a network together that draws together different perspectives across a complex system and gets them together meaningfully to catalyse ideas and actually do something together. So the A-Lab process and methodology brought together the whole renewable energy industry to think through what is that shared future that they can generate together from different industry perspectives, from different consumer stakeholder perspectives. What does that future look like? And then after you've done that, once you've picked a network that has a diversity of people in it, that can bring in different methods and disciplinary knowledge that can potentially scale, so that can be an open thing that can bring in people from all around the world. How then do you start to frame up a challenge? And that's something that Roger can talk to a group about in more detail. So from that future, what are those big challenges that would need to be solved, or building blocks that would need to be realised in order for that future to be real? So who's been part of the A-Lab journey so far? We got anyone from A-Lab here? I'll hesitate. So a few of the frames that we've developed for that one, for example, was around advanced grid planning, which I think they referred to as the Internet of Energy. So for the future that the industry foresaw, one of the key frames that they would have to innovate within, and one of the key building blocks that they would have to nail, was how you did advanced grid planning. And you can see with all the issues around South Australia and the way that our grids work currently, there's a big problem to solve there. So that was one of their key frames, which they then ran innovation labs around. So that brings us to the third part, which is the lab part of Innovation Amplified. And I think a lot of today we're going to focus on some of the steps within this lab. David, I might actually hand over to you just to talk through those three stages as our Chief Innovation Officer.
Just before I do, Bill, I'd just like to encourage people today also to spend some time thinking about the engage. And if we reflect on A-Lab brought together, or not just A-Lab, like our methodology in general, we tend to bring people together from a given industry or sector or discipline. And there's a whole bunch of evidence that suggests that the best ideas come when you work at the edge of disciplines. And there's a really interesting term coming out of MIT at the moment called anti-disciplinary, which is let's forget about disciplines and look for the stuff that sits in between. I'll just give you two examples. There's this online platform called Innocentive. Have people heard of Innocentive? Innocentive is a really fantastic platform. You should check it out. Companies pay money, they put their challenge up online, and then people from around the world submit ideas that they think will solve it. And some researchers have done some analysis on that, and the people with the best ideas, the most successful ideas, are on average the furthest away in the disciplinary sense from where the challenge started. And it just happens over and over again. And another example, more specific example, played out at Unilever a few years ago. And Unilever had this problem, the nozzles that they were using to spray out the material that was making their washing powder soap just kept clogging. And they got all these mathematicians and physicists and fluid dynamic experts to come in and to design methods, and they took a real theoretical approach to it. And they just couldn't crack it. And they got in some synthetic biologists instead, and the synthetic biologists realised they had absolutely no idea how to write mathematical equations and, you know, physics models and fluid dynamic, whatever. And so they took a complete trial and error approach. And so they just designed 10 nozzles, they tested them, they picked the best 3, they made small modifications on those 3, then they ran those, they picked the next best 10, they ran 10 of those, they picked the best 3, and they just did that, and they ended up with 57 models. And the nozzle that they ended up getting was absolutely perfect. And the shape of the nozzle is completely unpredictable. Like, it kind of moves like this throughout this nozzle, and it was absolutely nothing like what the physicists and the mathematicians designed. And so it was this complete randomness that came out of this trial and error approach that you wouldn't have got if you had taken an expert approach to solving the problem, because you come in with these, you know, these assumptions and these experiences that define how you approach it. So just when you're thinking about this engage pit, I'd be really interested in people's thoughts. How do we crowd in the system from outside of the system that we're thinking about? So if we're thinking about energy, how would we have done that? If we were going to do it again, how would we have done it, but had everyone from teachers to swimming instructors to, you know, biologists to ethnographers to design, like kind of everyone. And how do we do that routinely without exhausting the people that are in our network? Right. So the lab, the purpose, the basic concept of the lab is, once you've understood the problem, once you've understood the challenge that you're working on, once you've crowded in the ecosystem around that problem and you've started to uncover some insights, and you might have some leading ideas that you want to start to do something with, the idea is that you put it into this pretty rapid build, measure, learn loop cycle, which is where you start provoking ideas or catalysing ideas. You then put that through a rapid prototyping process, which I think everyone is pretty familiar with. And that's that accelerate part. You work with, and the important part there is, rather than trying to prototype ourselves, we utilise partners, so we leverage the scaled network effect, where we use partners to help us go out and test our ideas as quickly as possible. And that once you get your minimum viable product, you prove that the customers or the users are interested in the solution that you're trying to push. You then look for proof of scale, and you start to build that go-to-market or that go-to-impact process through scaling, and you roll it out. That's kind of it. Does that make sense?
So if we think about this framework as underpinning what we're going to explore today, we might go to some more specific questions and the territory that we want to traverse. So if we can grab the next slide. So coming out of the last conversation that Dirk ran around behavioural psychology, if you remember, there was a conversation with Nina towards the end that we wanted to explore a little bit further, which is essentially how do we actually empower that framework we were just looking through, more specifically, or more generally perhaps, how do we actually get people to collaborate effectively? And there's different sort of versions of that. When we've got people locked in a room for the day, how do we actually get the most collaboration, the most interesting ideas, the most innovation out of that room? But it might also be a virtual network, so it could be a digital process potentially. It could be, in the grand sense, a big coalition that we're assembling, like a collective impact model. So what sorts of things could we experiment with as part of our bleeding edge methodology to be able to do that more effectively? Amy or Lee, did you want to add any more kind of priming or framing to that? Mm-hmm. Cool. Do people feel like they understand what we're trying to do today, what we're looking at? Any questions? We'll get into conversation and see what happens. So the way we're going to do this, we're going to start with some quick provocations from some of our experts. Then we're going to form into some groups with those experts. We're then going to blend those groups. And as we do it, we're going to be trying to make things. So if you remember these from the last session, as you come across ideas for how we might empower that model, how we might drive collaboration in new and interesting ways, we're going to record them on these sheets in a simple way. You don't need to put all of the detail onto it. So that's basically us through to the end, and we'll do some sharing with each other as we go to cross-pollinate ideas. But without further ado, I'm going to pick on Dirk first because I think he has to run into an interview. So Dirk, you've got 3 minutes. So in 3 minutes, what are a few big ideas that you think might be relevant to the conversation today.
Thank you, Bill. This is quite different from the brief I got last night. I'm just going to pick up on the anti-disciplinarian idea, because I think that's quite useful. And just be a provocateur then, in the wild sense of the word. So somewhat building on the collective intelligence stuff or distributed cognition stuff that I mentioned at the end last week, there's probably three things I could say. First of all, how do I put about grow tentacles, tune in and out, and offload. So, okay, where does this come from? What is one of the most successful complex systems out there? It's ant colonies. They are very adaptive, very resilient, and they've been around for a very long time, and they will be around, I think, long after we've disappeared, but that's a completely different discussion. So how do they work? Well, they have tentacles. So when they communicate, when they come across each other, they kind of scan each other with their tentacles. And because of the exoskeletons that they have, they can tell by the traces on those exoskeletons where they have been. So if you have an ant, for instance, who spends a lot of time outside of the colony, that ant will have different types of traces on its exoskeletons. And based on that very simple mechanism, these colonies develop a division of labor that has typically 4 or 5 categories. So there's explorers, there's floor managers, if you like, maintenance crew. They actually have a reserve force. 25% of the colony just waits in like a mess or a little club somewhere in the colony until they get engaged to do things. So the reason that I mentioned this is there's actually an upper limit size. How many minutes do I have left?
Minute and a half.
Okay, that's good. Perfect. There's an upper limit to the size that will work. So ant colonies have an upper limit, and once they go above that, they become less efficient, so they don't go above that. So there have actually been biologists that have counted the amount of ants that you have in those colonies, which is not easy, I can tell you. But they always have the same division of labor, and they do that by having this very simple interaction that happens at the heart of the colony, and the whole system builds on that. So having tentacles is very important. The other thing is they offload. They use their environment to store information. So offloading traces on each other's exoskeletons is using your environment as an external memory. And the other thing is they tune in and out. It turns out that ant colonies have group personalities. And in biology they're called behavioral syndromes, which is basically the same thing as personalities, but then applied to animals and colonies. So you can typify different colonies in terms of their personality. You have some colonies that are very adventurous, very liberal, if you like, they go out. And you have some colonies that are far more conservative, so they stay closer to the center of the colony. And depending on the environment that they live in, one type of personality or behavioral syndrome will work better than the other. So what does this all mean? Well, it means that there's a strong parallel with this thing called cognitive distribution, distributed cognition and collective intelligence in the behavioral sciences, in the sense that good complex systems, they offload on the environment like we do in our workshops. We use post-it notes, we use visualizations. They tune in or out. Group identities, as I mentioned last week, are more important than personal identities, but they don't have tentacles, so that's where the metaphor stops. Thank you.
Cool. All right, thanks very much, Dad. So we'll give him a round of applause. So Dirk has to run into an interview, so we will have a group that's thinking about how you'd make a museum for ants, and I might run that group to start with, but thanks very much, Dirk. Okay, I'm going to toss to Amy next. Amy, I'm going to give you 1 minute because you'll actually be able to talk to your group in more detail. So for the rest of them, we'll just go 1 minute. So what sort of territory do you think you'll traverse from your particular perspective?
Sure. Well, I've got a pretty short list here, Bill, so hopefully it'll fit under a minute. It's 6 P's today. Peas like the letter, not peas like the vegetable. I suppose it could be a vegetable. So the first P for me is purpose. And I think for me, when it comes to working together, True collaboration isn't just coming to an agreed position at the end, it's about building an agreed position together. So thinking about that kind of thing, shared purpose in the room or in a group can be really valuable, but sometimes also a shared enemy can help. So have a think about that. The second P is power. So power imbalances, perceived or real, can often generate things like anger or frustration or vulnerability or pain, and it can really impede collaboration. And the most obvious is hierarchy, but there's other broader cultural power imbalances in the world around us, beyond the room, that play into the dynamics in a room or in a project. So in our particular society, we value science more than social science. We value white-collar workers more than blue-collar workers. We value people who speak confidently over people who may struggle with words. And those kind of values will creep into any other project situation as well. And you as a person working on a project will also have implicit assumptions, and there's no problem with that, that's life. But if we don't acknowledge them, it can really impede how we operate with and within a group. The third P is people. The way people behave really matters. Humility, listening are often skills that can be really valuable, but often lack in these kind of group settings. And there's a kind of provocation around people don't have to like each other to collaborate, but sometimes it helps. The fourth P is place. Now, in social theory, food and drink are the basis for collegiality. And I know that Betsy might talk a bit more about that. The other thing that's really important is exchange. If people give and take, especially material objects, they build relationships over time. So maybe we could think about what people can physically give to each other rather than just kind of sharing ideas. The kind of place you're in can send all sorts of messages, and they can help people feel different things: confidence, less confidence, out of place. The two final Ps are preparation. Deep and detailed preparation can really make a difference, especially understanding some of the things I've already talked about. And good collaboration often doesn't happen by accident, even though it looks like it might. And the final thing is persistence. Human relationships take a long time to build. Trust is really quick to break and really hard to rebuild. And for me, I think the Innovation Amplified model, while we talk about engagement being in a particular arm of it, I think we've got to persist with all of these strategies of engagement and people and collaboration throughout the entire model, and not just within that particular arm of engagement. So there you go, the 6 Ps. Purpose, power, people, place, preparation, persistence.
Cool. So hopefully there's ideas starting to gestate in people's heads, because I think there's some really excellent prompts in that. Lee, what do you want to talk about today?
So when I think of visual in collaboration, one of the things that comes to mind is how we very rapidly start sketching things out. When we're listening, we start plotting things up and putting lines and connections and shapes. But I'm going to move away from that completely into another area that I became quite interested in before I came here, which was actually exploring the area of visual research methods. So the question is, what if? What if the people that we had to get some information from were illiterate, spoke a different language, came from a completely different sort of space? What images would we need to pull together and explore, and how would we check them to make sure, if we weren't talking, that the understanding that we were getting was the same understanding that they were getting? Short and sweet, but that's what's interesting to me.
Thanks, Lee. Roger, just from an innovation frames perspective, just to introduce it, because you can sit in a group and talk to people about it too.
Sure. So Frame Innovation is the title of my old boss as of end of last week, Case Dorse, who wrote up his theory of frame creation. Why is it called Frame Innovation? Because the publisher wanted innovation in the book title. The methodology is actually about creating new frames or new perspectives on a problem. We often communicate about finding the problem behind the problem and solving that problem rather than the problem that is presented in the brief, and I'm sure that's really familiar to a lot of you. A lot of our work has been about finding the gaps between the disciplines, finding metaphors, as Dirk was talking about, in order to create new solution frames, and drawing on different disciplines that may not have been near the problem. So the body of work that I am coming from has been very deliberate about finding processes in projects to facilitate that. And just to give a really simple example, probably my favourite project from last year was the work I did with the community of Wilcannia. They invited us out to help them with youth suicide and domestic violence, and through using our methodology we found really quickly that the problem was not about necessarily about youth suicide or domestic violence. It was about empowerment and how previous government attempts to solve some of the societal issues had disempowered the community. So finding an empowerment model that would work is the new frame.
Cool. All right, thanks very much, Roger. And last but not least, Betsy, we'd like you to talk to us about the nature of space, making a comfortable place, and any of your thoughts about what makes for creating an experience for people in which they can collaborate.
Someplace comfortable that invites people in and maybe gives them permission to think differently from how they normally do. The sorts of reactions we get when we get public servants here is because they're out of the cube, they've got light, they've got space, and it's not a standard setup. So I think changing what people expect or what they're used to, and then you think, I have permission to be different or to think differently. I'm presenting people with things. If you can see it, you might use it or you might do it.
Like the opposite of employment today.
Yeah, that's right. And just in terms of space and artifacts and how they influence people, I find having a microphone and doing this really changes my experience of relating to you. I feel like I'm performing all of a sudden and not like I'm just talking to my colleagues. It's actually quite discomforting. It's a bit weird. Anyway, unfortunately, it's also required in order to record it. So that's not a criticism. It's just these are the sorts of things that influence the way people feel and behave. So we've now got half an hour we've had some brain food. Now we're going to sift through that brain food together. We'll form 3 groups, I think, which should give us groups of about 5 or 6. And I think our expert provocateurs can float through some of those conversations and catalyse our own network in the process. So if I can ask you all to self-organise, find a space where 5 or 6 of you can fit comfortably around a table. And for our provocateurs, I'll just ask you to keep moving every sort of 5 or 10 minutes. If you're in a good conversation, maybe stay put, don't worry about it too much, but try and spread yourselves out and spread the love as we go. I'll bring around templates. The output that we're after here is filling in as many of these templates as we can. We're just after essentially a sense of where are there some really interesting ideas about how we can empower this collaboration framework and what might it look like. So you don't need to worry about all the different bits on that sheet, but if you just give a sense of what the idea is, we'll share them at the end, and we might do a few pauses in between to share as we go as well.
Can we self-select which one?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And you can the conversations can go on tangents and diverge. Don't worry too much about control in that sense. But if you can self-organise, start talking.
So our idea was...
Just give it a moment, I think it'll kick in. Right now.
So our idea was... Okay, no microphone, it's not working.
I think so.
Was, of course, the Think Place Mobile Design Lab. Some of you may have heard about this one before, but essentially it's how can we take our studio space out on the road. So some ideas could be to fit out a caravan. It could be to get a bus and deck it out. Or it could be super small, like what's the ideal kit we need to take on the road and have that ready to go. We could start to think about pitching that idea in proposals and hire a van and test it out. We don't have to commit straight away to buying a caravan, but it would be cool.
Thanks very much, Anna. Who's got another idea that they want to share?
Caitlin.
Caitlin, you've been nominated. Well and told.
So just going off a point that Amy made about so often finding a common goal or finding things in common can really help people to get on with each other and collaborate. I also think finding a common enemy often brings people together. So yeah, I was thinking the enemy doesn't have to be a person, as Nat pointed out. It can be like an object or an idea. And then just one sort of idea to make this make sense would be if you put a whole bunch of people in a room and then you turn the aircon off on a really, really hot day. So that's kind of playing with the space as well. They're experiencing something together that's really pissing everyone off, but that will make them feel closer as a group, and it might bring out more collaboration because they've experienced something together.
Well done. Cool idea. And I think we actually have accidentally done that in the past, and it did work quite well. I can remember we stuffed up the booking for the space, and we ended up running a workshop in the corridor outside the women's toilets with a bunch of engineers. And for the first time, they started behaving and engaging, and I don't know if that was anything to do with women's toilets. I think it was more that adversity, they had to rise to it, and all of a sudden there was no organisation. They just had to actually take responsibility for themselves, which was kind of cool. This table, have you got an idea you want to share?
We spoke about this idea of 6 degrees of separation. So we don't have to solve the problem, or the selected people don't have to solve the problem, but we all know a smart person or an interesting person who can either be an alternative or a +1. And so you can think about the mix of those skills and those experiences. And the influence of involvement is actually the randomness of the problem solver mix, and influencing it through Think Place's power of having that TED power, so the TED Talk power of branding and awareness. That's the idea.
Does that mean we can also get Kevin Bacon to solve our problems?
Any other ideas that people are quite excited about you want to share? We can go a few more. I'm going to insist on at least 2 more, so that's the gauntlet.
We had another one over there. Ben's got one, yeah.
Great volunteer.
So we liked Amy's 6 Ps, and we spell it as the legume. So we went for power and place, and we were both thinking about different experiences we've had where you get, especially public servants, into a room and they're always worrying about what's outside the room. They're worrying about their chief executive, they're worrying about their expert advisory panel, and they move, and because we went to their place, they moved from their cubicles into a cubicle that could hold more of them. And they just could never break free of the external influences. So we had a conversation about what would you do to disconnect people? Would you use, some sort of ritual as they went into the room? Would you do other things to try and disconnect them from their daily cubicle to free up their thinking?
I think that should go next because that segues into this
disruptive space. So that no pitchforks involved, although there could be. And this is something that we've been thinking about for our workshop rooms, is about perhaps how could you reframe the way that people interact with one another by perhaps taking away conventional cues within a space. So the people from their cubicles each day, they're quite familiar to sitting at tables and chairs. Perhaps we take away tables and chairs. So suddenly there's lounges and cafe tables, stand-up tables, and they have to have their whole workshop without a pen and paper. They have to have their whole workshop, using whiteboards, using Lego, using a whole lot of other things that are unconventional for them.
Cool. All right, last but not least, anyone got a final idea they want to throw in? Another one from over this group? You guys, your eyes are flashing, which suggests there's one you're excited about.
Yeah, let's do one.
So we talked a lot about how you can use scenarios, and in particular we thought rather than a written scenario, we could get real people in to play out scenarios. And between Kirsten and David, we realised that some of the best disruptive thinkers are actually high school students. So how could we use high school students in our workshops that would both get people thinking very differently, but also give high school students experiences that they could find valuable, given that there are far fewer entry-level jobs available and a lot more automation, making it harder for them to enter the workforce.
All right.
Additions?
Did I miss anything?
Thanks very much, everyone. We should probably pause that there and get back to our Friday afternoons. But thank you very much for your participation. Conversation doesn't have to end here. I mean, these are the sorts of conversations that, me personally, and I know a lot of us, we really enjoy these types of conversations, but you often don't get the space and time to do it. So I would like to thank Lee and Amy and John for continuing to create these spaces for us and the attention to detail and the organisation that they put into it. Yeah, remember you can always invite people to the pub and talk about this stuff, and that's fun. So that's my recommendation on collaboration generally. The pub. Yes. See you later.